Labour governments have been elected by huge landslide votes before, but you have to go back to the previous century, 1945 and 1997, to revisit those days. Now they seem set to write a similar chapter in history. In fact, the party's margin in the polls above their rivals has been so large that Labour politicians have spent much of the campaign playing down predictions of a supermajority, worried that voters won't bother to turn out if they believe the result is a foregone conclusion. Well, keeping his feet on the ground while providing some context to the situation is John McTernan. As Tony Blair's political advisor and speechwriter, he's seen it all before, but even he is looking forward to the day after the election with a keen sense of optimism. John, thank you for making some time for us. In 1997, you were at the centre of all the celebrations when Tony Blair became Prime Minister. Are you expecting, with the predictions the way they are you expecting a similar scene this time?
It's funny, isn't it? It was in May. I remember coming out of the Royal Festival Hall at 4 in the morning, and there were people lining Waterloo Bridge, and they applauded us as we came out one by one. Had no idea who we were, but they applauded. And I think they were applauding themselves because they'd had the courage to do something they didn't think was possible, which was change. Now, I think there's a great mood for change in the country now. But there was an optimism because there was growth in the economy, and people felt they could imagine things were going to get better. Now I think people have been ground down by politics. They have really come to believe with this government, 5 prime ministers in 6 years, that you can change prime minister, but nothing changes. And I think that's a concern that I have, that it'll be a more sombre, I think, victory for the voters and for the Labour Party.
Well, you've likened the election to a national act of exorcism.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what degree that this moment might shape the way politics go for quite a while to come.
Yeah, so I think that there's an anger with this government, its failures, but mainly hanging on too long. Rishi Sunak should have had, I think, an election sooner than this, because the longer, in Australia we used to say, if you put the vote off, put the election off, the voters just sit there on their verandas with their baseball bats waiting for you, give you a worse beating. And I think there's an element of punishment beating coming. And the Conservative government broke the emotional contract with the voters when Boris Johnson was found to be partying in Number 10. That, I think, they liked him as a joker, then it turned out he was laughing at us. They didn't like that. And then Liz Truss broke the most precious commodity, which is people's trust in the Tories to manage the economy. So 2 big reasons to push to push them out of the leadership of the country. And I think that is really going to set 2 tones, I think, for the future. One is, how does Labour rebuild trust? How can they get people to believe actually things can get better rather than just get worse and worse and worse? And I think it will also, the legacy for the Conservative Party is, you already see it, they're arguing with themselves, among themselves, about who's responsible for losing. They've not lost yet, but they're already fighting over who's going to be the next leader, what's their analysis, should they like Nigel Farage, not like Nigel Farage, and those are really better left until the day after the election.
Now, there are the critics of the Labour leader who say that Sir Keir Starmer is essentially a politician with no real charisma or kind of real character that people can relate to, and that perhaps is just lucky to be in at a time when Labour is kind of on the rise while the opposition is crumbling. To what degree do you think that is the case, or has he actually transformed the Labour Party into a much more workable
Look,
party?
I think he's massively underestimated. People who think he's not charismatic should go out for a night in the pub with him. He is great in a pub. I had a taxi driver once back from a TV interview, and he's going, the only politician I really like among the modern ones is that Keir Starmer. I met him in a pub. It was an Arsenal pub, but he knows his football. And I think that sense of him, he's not flashy, but we tried flashy with Boris Johnson. He's not ideological. We tried ideological with Jeremy Corbyn, who lost the election with Labour, and with Liz Truss as Prime Minister. So I think his caution fits the age. And I think the fact he's not flashy is one of the reasons people have been willing to switch over. It's been a big switch from Labour had its worst defeat since the 1930s, and yet it's now looking at its biggest win since maybe 1945. So historic defeat followed by historic victory, and Keir has to be given credit for that. Nobody else really fancied being the leader for this election. He took it and he's changed the party.
Well, in your role as a political advisor to Tony Blair, you had to write his speeches, and You know the power of communication, how important it is. And I wonder if you're writing something for Keir Starmer to inspire the masses, what would you put in his speeches?
Look, I would say something along the lines of what I often say, which is, you've tried a character, how about a man with a plan? Just speak plainly to people and level with them. And I've seen it in him in dealing with the doctors, junior doctors. I saw a junior doctor debating with him and said, look, will you give us our pay deal? Will you settle? And he went, you've asked for 35%. That's not a negotiation if you get what you ask for. I'm going to have to... And I thought the way he just reasoned, you could see the junior doctor coming across to him and going, do you know what? I mean, I might disagree, but it's a fair point. I think he should occupy that space of making a fair point, making it well, and being serious and saying, look, it's taken 14 years to run down the economy. It'll take at least 10 years to build it up. And I think the mission-driven government he started talking about is really interesting, because he says, really, we've got a problem. We've all got a problem. What are we going to do about it? And I think if there's more of that kind of language, what will we do together, that gives everybody a role in changing the country.
So the inclusivity aspect, which is very important, of course.
Yeah, and mobilising, actually, saying to doctors, nurses, but also us, health isn't all about the health service. Health is about our behaviours, what we eat, how much we drink, whether we exercise. So those things, I think. But it's inclusive, not divisive, and I think that's a very important change in tone.
Talking of inclusivity, Britain's departure from the European Union caused a lot of problems. It was a momentous event, and it took place, of course, during the Conservative rule. Opponents of Brexit believe that leaving the EU has become a disaster for the economy, and that even supporters have expressed disappointment for this post-Brexit environment. So I wonder, how would Sir Keir Starmer, do you think, improve relations with Britain's European neighbours, considering what's happened?
Yeah, so look, the thing in a democracy is the voters are never wrong. And if you start from the presumption, the presupposition and the assertion, the voters are wrong and you can reverse there, you can't. The country made a decision. It's cost us 4% of GDP. What Labour has to do is find ways to build different pillars. So maybe a pillar on freedom of movement for young people, which the European Union are interested in. That'd be good for our young people. Maybe a pillar on travel that includes actors and musicians. I know musicians who've had difficulty travelling to festivals and gigs. Maybe a pillar on veterinary affairs, on the transport of cattle and meat. Those areas, like pillar by pillar, you could work on it. Like something like, what about the trading of carbon over borders, which is essential for getting green hydrogen, getting green steel. So in those different ways, you can see, I saw a thing saying, criticising the Labour are going to have an agreement with the European Union, which is part of their plans to help heavy industry. And I thought, that's a fight I'd love to have, because if Labour say, we're for green steel, we're for green hydrogen, we're for this modern manufacturing, factory work, all this modern work, and Brexiteers go, you can't do that. It's like, well, okay, so you're against British steel? You're against steel making continuing? So I think that's the way to frame it and phrase it. If it's good for British industry, good for British artists touring, good for British jobs, I think you can make the case for it. And absolutely, to deal with irregular migration, immigration, you need cooperation with the policing authorities, the secret services of European countries. And Labour can do that because I think Keir Starmer will be trusted to do that, because he's actually not knee-jerk anti-European. It's not anti-European. We've got to be the UK with the EU, just as we are on some of the Ukrainian security and defence issues.
All these pillars sound like a rebuilding of the house. Is this like kind of a slow re-entry? Do you think he'd be supported for that?
Well, so I think you can never go back. It's true in politics as it is true as in life. The European Union has said it wants to bring Ukraine into membership. Ukraine cannot have the same membership that Italy has or Spain has. That means Europe is looking at different forms of membership. There's no problem for me with closer working with Europe on defence, on security, on migration. Once you add these things up, they don't ever become rejoining, but they do become a new relationship, and it's our closest trading partner. However much progress we make with elements of trade deals with the US, trade is always higher with your closest partner, and I think that's partly why the European Union wants to start talking about freedom of movement for young people. They want to put something on the table, to start talking, have a deal. So we'll never rejoin, but I don't think the EU is the same.
A lot of our audience know very little about the man who might well become the next Prime Minister of Britain, and I wonder what you think that people really should know about him. What's really been missing in that portrait?
So I always think that people need to know just 2 or 3 things about you. One, he loves football, loves it. He loves Arsenal. He's a season ticket holder at Arsenal, but he loves playing football. He plays five-a-side football every week, and he's pretty good at it for a man who's in his early 60s. The younger people in the Labour Party play with him, and they say the only way to not be beaten by him is to push him over. So he's really good at that. He loves talking football in the pub. He loves his family. He had a beautiful interview at the weekend about how much his wife Vic is like the other half of him. So I think loving his wife and his family, that's a big thing. And I think, look, he says it again and again. He grew up working class. He grew up working class in Surrey, which is now such a prosperous part of England that nobody can really believe anybody was working class there. But, you know, in the 50s and 60s, you could be working class and live in areas where he grew up. So he grew up working class. He didn't go to Oxbridge, went to Leeds University. He came to politics late in life. He chose it. So I think if we put those things together, you start to get a picture of, you know, that's why he's a man with a plan. He had a plan to change the Labour Party. He's got a plan to change the country. I
know a lot of people I know overseas don't know the British system. I'm quite confused the fact he's Sir Keir Starmer, and yet he's, as you say, he's a working class man, a man of the people.
Yeah, well, we have an honours system, and you get honours of recognition of what you did. One of the things that he did was he prosecuted a lot of terrorists when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. He got to the top of that department of government. He also he helped to abolish the death penalty in lots of Caribbean countries, campaigning on that. He also changed the police service in Northern Ireland. The RUC, the police then, were not trusted by the Catholic community, the nationalist community. He was part of the people who changed it to a new institution called the Police Service in Northern Ireland, which is supported and backed by both communities, unionist and nationalist. And that is a huge thing to do. And the peace deal was not simply the Good Friday Agreement. The peace deal was building the institutions that could bring a country back together again that had been in the middle of a civil war. So I think it's that kind of, there's a practical bit of him. So his dad was a tool maker. He's kind of a change maker of building new institutions.
So he took Royal out of Royal Ulster Constabulary. I guess
yeah,
that's a good start.
No, that's quite a big one. And he got the knighthood for his public service. And I think maybe that defines him as a politician. He believes in politics as public service, not politics as ideology.
Now, you've talked about, obviously, what are essentially domestic agendas. How would Sir Keir Starmer do on the global stage, where the challenges are pretty severe at the moment? We've got the Israel-Hamas thing, we've got Ukraine-Russia, Congo actually going on, Sudan. How would he fare on the international stage?
So I know that he's going to be appointing David Lammy to be his Foreign Secretary. David Lammy is, I think, the first person to be Foreign Secretary in the UK for the Labour Party who comes from a Global South heritage, which I think is really important. I think Keir and his Defence Secretary, Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey, and David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, have been clear that Europe is a central part of our security, and that Boris Johnson made a joke, didn't he, about no one's going to need tanks anymore at one point, and now we need tanks. There's land warfare in Europe. I think on Israel-Hamas, Labour have got to a position where they do believe there should be a ceasefire, but obviously the return of hostages, but moving towards security and peace for both Palestinians and Israelis. That the two countries are side by side. They are never not going to have some form of common security. But Labour has to be able to be with the EU and with the US from a framework for common security, but also there's so much economic engagement between the UK and the Middle East now. So many of the countries there's British brands over in many countries, and there's British people working there and loving it. And so that building through trade and building through holidays and vacation and connection, building that up so there's an understanding, but a clear-eyed, hard-headed look at it as well.
Well, John, there seems to be a diminishing respect or enthusiasm for Western leaders nowadays. And I'm wondering what sort of opportunity this might create for Sir Keir Starmer to put himself out there as someone who can be relied upon. What kind of opening does it give to him?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question. I think the global Britain brand that the Tories came up with is a really powerful one. Britain should be global. Britain's got to be Britain abroad, outside of the European Union. We have a platform in the Commonwealth where a lot of countries in the global south are members of that. I think there's this historic relationships which have had their difficulties at times with Africa. But those are historic relationships around the Mediterranean. And Labour in government has to be a positive force for using the power of one of the richest countries in the world to bring prosperity where it can. I always remember from when I was in government, when you look at the migration push from Africa, it's like if we don't go to them, they'll come to us. We have an interest in economic development in Africa, an interest in economic development in North Africa and in the Middle East. And so I think there's a role there for somebody who makes things, builds things, fixes things, and being, a close ally of the US, still on the UN Security Council, but one who pushes for the decarbonising agenda. It's been important for Britain, but it's also a good way to cooperate with China. You can't always compete. Sometimes you have to cooperate. The same is true of work with India. We have to work with big countries, have to get together to solve some of the big global problems.
I'll touch on the US in a moment, but I wonder what it is you personally like, the thing you like most about Sir Keir Starmer.
The thing I like is his approachability. When I WhatsApp him, he gets back to me. And it's like, he's a really busy man. He's the leader of the Labour Party, but he knows me. He employs my daughter-in-law. He came to my son and daughter-in-law's wedding. He's a normal guy, and I think that is really underrated in politics. Just being a man of the people, which I think comes to be a flashy thing that you do in American style, a presidential. I'm a man of the people. Or you can do it in a kind of like, he's just a guy who'd walk down your street and talk to you, and I like that.
Is there anything in particular you don't like, or you'd say he might benefit from changing?
Look, I always think that you should be funny in politics, and he's very serious. So I think more jokes, but not dad jokes.
Now, there are still some issues with Labour politicians, that the kind of legacy, names like Diane Abbott or Jeremy Corbyn still kind of raise the hackles of some people who might be wanting something a bit different. How much of an issue might the shadow of that kind of legacy
Well, look, there's a difference, isn't there? Jeremy Corbyn's standing against a Labour candidate, so he's been expelled from the Labour Party. Diane Abbott is standing as a Labour candidate. I'm very pleased that she's doing that. I'm pleased she was let back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. She's a significant, a major figure in the Labour Party in London, in the black communities, as an inspiration for women coming into politics. And I thought some of her treatment recently by the Labour Party was cack-handed, to say the least. I'm glad she's back and has the dignity of her choosing herself to stand again. And I think there's room in the Labour Party for a wide range of opinions. The cliches, Harold Wilson's cliche, it's a broad church. The Labour Party is a broad church. And I kind of think, Diane Abbott and me don't agree on very much. We do agree on this thing. A Labour government is better than a Tory government. And Labour has to contain me with my views and Diane with her views, and that's when we're big enough and broad enough. Like I like to say, a plane needs two wings. A party needs two wings too.
Interesting. So what about the other names in the race here? What do you make of Rishi Sunak and Nigel Farage, for example?
So I can't understand, honestly, for the life of me, why Rishi Sunak came into politics. He doesn't seem good at it, but he doesn't seem to enjoy it. Like he looks, sometimes, when you see him in interviews, he seems to want to argue back with you when you ask him questions. Like, that's actually the job. He doesn't, you look at the way he executes things. If the idea was the dividing line in this election was a man with a plan, I've got a plan, stick to the plan, what kind of man with a plan announces the election in the street, in Downing Street, when it's raining and doesn't go, do you know what, boys? Can you check outside? Oh, it's raining. Let's go to Conservative HQ and do it from a room. It's not tough. It's stupid. And it's the kind of cack-handedness, like that one as well. Who comes back from D-Day early when you've got a chance of being photographed with the President of the United States? You could be talking to the President of the United States. You look important when you're there. You scuttle back to Britain. So it's the sense that he doesn't really know how to do politics. Nigel Farage is the opposite. He knows how to do politics, a certain type of politics, and his politics is destructive. He senses weakness and he came back into the election because he could see the Tory party, the country want to put the government out of their misery. Nigel Farage decided he wants to put the Tory party out of their misery, and he flourishes from the Tory party angst about him, their anger about him. They don't know whether to fight him or to love him. And you see this working out with cabinet ministers saying he should be back in the former cabinet minister saying he should be back in the Tory party, and other people going, no, he'll destroy us. He's a fire ship. So I think for Farage, and you mentioned Diane Abbott, now we're talking about Farage. I think this is the dullest election campaign I have known in my entire life. And it's only come to life when there's a debate around Diane, a debate around Farage. What do they both have together? They're big figures, they're characters, they're larger than life. I think there is something about our politics that producer Rishi Sunak, who doesn't even like politics. And the response is, you get a Farage.
So, interestingly enough, Nigel Farage just recently announced the manifesto for the Reform Party, and a contract with the people, he called it, and it included, issues of immigration and taxes and so on. How do you think those will resonate with the voters, who are rather disgruntled at the moment?
He's aiming at a certain type of voter. So you look at the country as a whole, look at the polls as a whole. 2/3 of voters want to vote Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green or Nationalist. Progressive parties. So is Rishi Sunak threatening that 2/3? No. What he's doing is fighting in the third of people who want to vote on the right of centre. So yeah, he's appealing to voters. He wants to split the Tory party. He wants to come, probably not in seats, but he wants to come over the Tory party in votes. So his is a kind of doubling down on the policy intentions of Johnson, of Truss and Sunak, the failed policy intentions. Now, he doesn't care if he can deliver these things. He's a populist. The Tory problem is they tried to fight a populist by promising similar things and knowing in their heart of hearts as a government you couldn't deliver them. Stop the boats? You can't stop the boats. You can reduce the boats. You can have a process in place to make sure that everybody goes through a quick process, and you can return people who don't have the right to be in the UK. But stop the boats was unachievable. Rishi Sunak didn't understand that. Farage understands that. He understands that the populist that you're aiming to, you're saying, throw things up in the air, vote for me.
Considering Nigel Farage's success in polling against the Conservative Party in general, it sounds like he's going to be a major enabler for the Labour Party.
That is true, although if you took him out, the Tories were still 20 points behind Labour. Whatever way you cut it, a 20-point deficit means you're going to get absolutely thrashed.
As we wrap up, I just want to look at a movie that kind of gets played every Christmas, Love Actually,
yes,
where Hugh Grant playing a prime minister, UK prime minister, stands up to a bullying American president. Could you ever see Sir Keir Starmer standing up to Donald Trump if that scenario was to arise?
So every prime minister of the UK, and I believe this of Rishi Sunak, as of any Labour prime minister, they will always put the UK first. Keir will put the UK first. Keir will not bend to the will or the whim of a president who wants something to be done that's not in the national interest. But if President Trump is re-elected, we have to work with President Trump, or whoever's the president of the United States. The US has its own politics. We don't interfere in other people's politics. It's a democracy. People get their choice. And if the country votes for President Trump, our job is to use the special relationship to make sure that the secure defence, to make sure continued NATO commitment. America committed to NATO, NATO committed to the defence of Western Europe.
Although there's a feeling that if things don't work out with Donald Trump in the White House, there might be a lot of name-calling across the Atlantic.
Oh, look, the thing is, when you lose, you lose. If Donald Trump loses this second bout, this return championship bout with Joe Biden, I think then he leaves politics. He won't leave public life because he's too big a character to leave public life. But, David Lammy, who's going to be our Foreign Secretary, in the past has said things which are derogatory about Donald Trump. He's now got a very strong relationship with both Joe Biden's team on foreign affairs and defence and national security, and with President Trump's team. And that's what you have to be, because there are big things going on in the world. Russia, China and Taiwan. And in the end, we have allies for a purpose, and that is Britain can't do everything on its own, but Britain does have values that it wants to see through the Commonwealth, through the Global South. It wants to see fair play, and when we work with America, it's normally better for the world.
John McTernan, thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks.